Salt Lake City, in the backyard of famed alternative researcher John Levi. And one could certainly understand why John Levi would go about the city of Salt Lake City and understand that there's something amiss with the accounts that we've been given. I certainly see it as one of the primary examples, and if only we lived in a world where something like this would be true, where we actually had a field of studies that concerned itself with alternative history. We're told that Salt Lake City was settled initially by the Church of Latter-day Saints in 1847 with a group of 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children. Now, it's very strange that this small group would be the group that would start Salt Lake City, and if you do the ratios and the math on it, none of it makes any sense. But in reality, it's no different than any of the other original settlement accounts that we have of the other cities that we've explored. Interestingly enough, in 23 short years, they managed to quickly establish a grid pattern and develop many buildings, that small group of people, to include a very large and impressive temple, which stands to this day. Supposedly, they started construction on it only a few short years after they started settling Salt Lake City. And that's a reason why this is one of the strangest accounts. And it's something we have to question because here is the temple itself, and yet on this bird's eye view, this is from 1870. Yet we're told that the temple wasn't finished until the early 1890s. So already we have a vast conflicting account. Was the artist on this bird's eye view simply being imaginative and showing what the temple would look like once it was concluded? It's hard to say. It's still impressive and bizarre that in just a few short years, 23 short years, the Salt Lake City Temple and the Tabernacle were constructed and finished. Now, we'll be given a more reasonable timeline, at least for the temple, and the fact that we're told it took them 40 years. Still, it's an astounding achievement to not only build a temple, not only build the Tabernacle, which is the dome structure below, and supposedly that was finished in the late 1860s. But again, who knows about these dates and these accounts? These are things that we have to question. Here's an early construction photo of the Salt Lake City Temple, or the Mormon Temple, whatever you want to actually call it. And these construction photos have the same issues that we see with others. I like how they're just showing the blocks laying there in nice order. Well, at least they have an orderly construction site. You would think they would have been able to finish the temple a lot faster. I mean, it's not as though they needed any sort of labor. We don't really know if there are aspects of the account of the settlement of Salt Lake City that we don't have. It's just strange, though, that we start with only 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children. Yet they were able to pull off this incredible edifice. Even if this was the only building that they built in Salt Lake City in those 40 years, just for that group of people that we're told, it doesn't make any sense. Either there's something to this account, there's information that we don't have, or this is evidence of something strange going on. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's the situation with every city. And yet, in the latter portion of the 19th century, we already have photos that show the completion of many of these incredible buildings in Salt Lake City, all done within even a few short decades, which, as I said, with the supposed amount of labor that they had available, 143 men and 3 women, and maybe they had the children working too, because child labor was a thing back then, perhaps they were able to erect this temple in that short amount of time. I mean, still, to me, it's impressive in 40 years. Moving around those kind of granite blocks and having them chopped and organized, it's very impressive. So that's the reason why Salt Lake City has our interest as alternative researchers, because it's one of the real smoking guns, if you will, that shows you that either the account that we're given could not possibly be correct, or there's something else going on. Now, here's what Salt Lake City looks like in the 1890s, and in this bird's eye view, we see even more build-out. And keep in mind, we haven't even had people there for 40 years yet. It is unbelievable. And yes, you'll say, well, but this is a bird's eye view from 1890. True. But when they made the bird's eye view, it had to be before 1890, and you're only looking at the 40-year mark of settlement from that small group of people. Now, could other Mormons, other settlers have come along and gradually went to this city in the middle of nowhere at that time, very isolated from the rest of the United States? Of course, it's possible. But it's really strange that all these stunning achievements were completed in such a short amount of time, that this community from a group of people that were persecuted and chased all around the United States, which is what the official count tells us, they were able to pull all this off. It's impressive. It's stunning. And here's an earlier photo of the construction of the temple from 1881. So what's really going on here? Is the timeline being shortened? Are we not giving all the details from the official account? Is this some sort of evidence of alternate realities? This could be anything and everything. And that's one of the reasons this is probably one of the more interesting conflicting accounts that we have. There's been recent renovations on the temple in Salt Lake City. And when we pull back the veil, if you will, a little bit, you start to see that the building itself seems to go into the ground a lot more than we realize. There's also a lot of questions and conflicting accounts with the construction of the building itself. And we'll look at it a little closer just to give you an idea as to why the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City is such an anomaly. We see in some of these closer photos that it appears that the foundation goes a lot deeper in the ground than we'd like to think. And so we have a lot of the classic hallmarks with this particular temple that we come across in the other buildings that we've looked at in other cities. Now, of course, people say, well, yes, but in the other cities it made more sense. They had a developed infrastructure. There were more people around, and those are true facts. And yet at the same time, when you examine the origin accounts of these other cities, it's actually quite a lot like Salt Lake City. A minimal group of people with minimal resources and no consideration with logistics whatsoever were able to achieve these stunning, remarkable buildings in a short amount of time. It just doesn't make any sense. Yet you look at this and you see the foundation and you see some of the details in this building. And as we zoom in a little bit here, we can see how far the foundation really does go down in the ground. And how deep does it go down? Well, there's a lot of accounts on the ground that'll tell you that the building goes down in the ground a lot deeper than we've been told or we'd like to think. And I find myself considering the fact that some of the other remarkable edifices we've looked at in other cities, how many of them go much further in the ground and they just haven't done this kind of renovation. And another question is, what exactly has prompted this renovation on the temple in Salt Lake City? We'll, of course, be told it's because the building is over 150 years old and therefore it needs some structural improvements. Of course, the construction was finished in 1890, but they started on it in 1850. So again, you have all these conflicting accounts, you have all this overlapping information, and yet here in this photo, you can see how far down this building really goes into the ground. What exactly is going on here? Why is it so difficult for us just to get simple and direct answers that make sense? This is something we have to question when we're considering all these accounts and the origins of these cities, Salt Lake City included, and the other cities that we've explored in the eastern portion of the United States. Strangely enough, we've even seen rubbling and some destruction in some of the photos of Salt Lake City. Is there something that's being concealed? Is there something we're not supposed to know about? Now, of course, the contractors that are doing this, they're just doing their job. So to them, it's not really going to stand out too much. They might be surprised by how well constructed the building is, or there's been other accounts that the buildings aren't very well constructed. There's a recurring theme of certain state capitals that they constantly have to renovate them. Yet looking at the interior of the temple, we see a gorgeous building. It's not just the fact that they created a gorgeous building on the exterior, it's also the interior. We have to consider the details of the walls, the ceilings, all the ornate planning that went into the construction of the interior. And when we actually have construction photos, we typically see contradictions in what we see in the construction photo and then what we see in the layout of the interior. Look at the beauty, the detail. And this is an incredible structure. Yes, this is an amazing temple. Yes, this is a religious place of worship, so we're told. But you have the columns, you have what looked to be an alteration on pediments, and you have the beautiful ceiling. Once again, we have to question, if this is from a predecessor civilization, were there different aspects to it? And I know it's very astounding to even suggest such a thing, but if you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you know that's exactly what we're exploring. Because it's Salt Lake City that really stands out as something that seems to be a little bit different, because of the fact that it has a compressed account, because of the fact that, I don't know, I'd almost be more willing to accept divine intervention as an acceptable explanation for how this city was settled and how these edifices were completed in such a short amount of time. And there you see it again, more of the columns with some of the decoration on them. You still see the same hallmarks of construction. Now, someone will tell you, well, according to the historical account, it's because that there were architects that went around and they studied Athens and Rome and decided they want to build buildings like that back in the 18th century. Sure. And there was no regard for how difficult it would be logistically, how difficult it would be to acquire all these beautiful materials. And not to mention that they were still somehow able to build these buildings exactly like they supposedly did in Rome and Athens, despite the fact that there's over 1,000 years or more between the constructions. Look at this beautiful doorway here on the temple and the detail that went into this. Now, you oftentimes see this beehive symbol that's also associated with Utah. There's a lot of other symbols that get associated with Utah. Look at this gorgeous room. And here you see it as well with the detail in the ceiling and the walls. And this is something that we've seen in these other older buildings. This is very difficult to achieve, and anyone who's in finishing will tell you that this just isn't something that they bother with modern buildings, and we'll get the usual array of reasons why we don't do it. We don't have the funds, we don't have the will, we don't have the artisans, etc. Despite the fact that we have all this incredible, remarkable technology, we can do these sort of rooms, we can do these sort of interiors, but it's just not practicable, and we have limitations on money. Oh, by the way, make sure you read about the expansion of the debt ceiling next week again. And don't worry about inflation. That never seems to be a problem. It's only a problem when you're given a reason for why certain things can't be done. So all I'm saying is I'm not really accepting all these explanations we're given. And now we move on to the Tabernacle. And the Tabernacle was constructed, or at least it was completed before the temple. And this is another remarkable and beautiful place of worship. And this is a very unique building because this is not a building that you see other types of this building across the United States. Although if you look a little bit more, you do get hints of this sort of construction type. So who exactly knows what's going on here? And it has a very beautiful dome, and keep in mind this is from the 1860s. And there are some very intriguing early construction photos and different renderings of what this building looked like as they were constructing it. So just to recount, this was finished in 1867, not 20 years after the 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children had arrived in Salt Lake City. And that's what I'm talking about, where we have these strange things with the facts of the settlement of a city, not just Salt Lake City, but all the other cities. It started with 3 random individuals. Here's an early photo of the Tabernacle, and we also see the slabs of granite or limestone or sandstone or whatever they're going to tell us that they used to construct the temple, which they did so concurrently while they were building the tabernacle and then continued after completing the tabernacle in 1867, according to the official account. And you might notice that I'm getting a lot more leery of the official account because none of this makes any sense. And here we see a couple photos of the tabernacle and the supposed unique method of construction that they used with it. And we have the usual questions that arise when we do actually see photos of construction. Very interesting that they seem to build this building a little differently than they would other buildings, where they seem to build it all the way to the top and then built it across. You tend not to see that. Usually what you see is them starting on the foundation. But I'm sure there's somebody who's watching this video who will let me know in the comments what this construction type is and how it's something that somebody observed in Europe or in Athens from a couple centuries ago. And it all makes perfect sense. And never mind the logistical considerations. People just worked harder. And these materials were readily available. And it was no issue moving heavy granite blocks miles, hundreds of miles across the desert with no logistics, because people really didn't need to drink water or eat then, apparently. And sometimes I don't wonder if that's the case, because we come across a lot of these great structures and they don't seem to have restrooms. The inside of the tabernacle is nothing to sneeze at either, because you see we have the usual columns, and it looks like this is marble. I have not had the pleasure of being inside the tabernacle, but if anybody has, please let me know in the comments. I always think, once again, it's important to look inside these buildings because you get an entirely different story than what you see just on the outside. Look at this organ. Beautiful and incredible, and supposedly this is in the tabernacle as well, and I have no reason to doubt that. You know, it reminds me of the Alpha Omega bomb from Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Never quite seen an organ like that, and of course that's something we always focus on, is the interesting organs that we see in the large religious buildings. And there's the entire layout of the tabernacle, just a very beautiful and unique building. And there's something about it that seems, I don't know, as though it's displaced in time, displaced in existence. What's the real story behind the tabernacle? Are we to consider that they actually built it in 20 years with just a very minimal labor pool? Or are we to believe that many people just came by Salt Lake City and decided to join the group of Mormon settlers? I mean, it's possible, and maybe the account just doesn't relate it that well. Or it's part of building a myth. I'm not suggesting that people don't want to build myths and it doesn't make a lot of sense to do so. It is another consideration, and it's a fair consideration. Yet regardless of what perspective you approach it from, when you're told that this unique lattice work of wood was something that was innovated for this building and then was not really used again, or maybe it was, you just don't know, they just opted not to talk about it. It's just another example of many conflicting accounts, and another example of when you ask questions, instead of getting answers, you get 10 more questions. And then you'll be ridiculed for asking questions, which I always find is quite interesting, because nobody wants to ever have a legitimate intellectual conversation about the possibilities of things. They simply want to ridicule you for asking questions. There's nothing suspicious about that now, is there? But I understand that's just how people are indoctrinated to operate, and that's fine. Please, continue to ridicule. it actually gives clues as well. Very beautiful interior photos of this building. And this is something that you do not see as much as you do the other traditional church structures. So again, I ask the question, what exactly is going on? Because this is some of the evidence, like with Duluth, when we explored Duluth a couple months ago, we saw something that didn't really make a lot of sense. And now we go to the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. So originally this was constructed as a hotel in Salt Lake City from 1909 to 1911, and we see the usual hallmarks of such beautiful construction from that very early time frame. We have the very large foundation stones, and then we see something that exceeds Art Deco, or at least what we're told Art Deco is in beauty. We have the usual columns that are amalgamated with the wall, and we see the beautiful decorative detail. At some point, it was transitioned from being a hotel to the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. So let's just think about that. 1909 to 1911, and again, you see an incredible, beautiful building. Now, I believe John Levi's gotten on the ground. I recall one of his earlier videos where he actually looked at this building very close, and it's something else that stands out from the surrounding buildings in terms of beauty and in terms of decorative detail that you see. But it's interesting because it's, once again, not just on the outside of the building, it's also on the inside of the building. And I think that's something that we tend to miss with the Art Deco buildings, because with the Art Deco buildings, you see decorative detail along some of the walls and then in the roof, such as we did with the Plummer building in Rochester, Minnesota. But then when you actually go and you look inside the building, you see a completely different story, as you do here in the lobby. I mean, interior columns that are very beautifully decorated, lobby bits, the ceiling, and then, of course, to say nothing of the floor. I wonder what this really looked like, though, when it was constructed in the early 20th century. And yet, I find the same kind of account that I do that we just saw with the Salt Lake City Temple and the Tabernacle. And here you see it again with the beauty in the ceiling, with the chandeliers and all the decorative detail in the walls where they meet the ceiling, as though they just had infinite amounts of time and the ability to do all of this in the early 20th century. And I enjoy the fact that people say, well, of course they could do it back then. Artisans and logistics were no consideration. And that's the funny thing, is to accept the mainstream account at face value, you have to overlook a lot of things. You claim to be a purveyor of science and fact, and yet at the same time, you simply have to accept it without asking questions. That's where I always had the issue with it. This is a beautiful lobby area for this building. And we'll be told it was simply a hotel and now it was converted to a memorial building. Which, okay, fine, sensible enough, but why? Why would you have to put all this effort in this detail? One of my jokes is you always know an old world building when you can get married in it, and you know that your marriage won't break up because you got married in some ugly government building that was constructed in, 1950 or afterwards. I could see why someone would want to get married in this beautiful building. I mean, there's something that's a fairy tale quality about it, and it endures to this day. Naturally, if you tried to get married in a building after 1950, that would be all she wrote. And now on to the Utah State Capitol, which is also located in Salt Lake City. Constructed from 1912 to 1916, here we have another example of what's quote-unquote neoclassical revival, Corinthian revival. I don't know, I don't care about these architectural terms anymore. We'll just call this U.S. Capitol revival style, and we'll also say it includes democracy. And we see the usual hallmarks and the trappings of our great Capitol buildings, 1912 to 1916. This is the same time that a lot of other states were either rebuilding their previous state capitals that had burnt down, and yet you could still get a pretty beautiful state capitol from this time frame, allegedly. When I look at the columns and the pediment and the dome overall, and also the columns that go up into the dome, it's intriguing to me that you see the same construction hallmarks across all these U.S. state capitals. And there's some construction photos, and of course we have the usual questions about them. Just love the sky in all these construction photos. I'm sure, again, that's just another coincidence that there was these strange skies that existed at the time. Perhaps there was some condition with the climate that we're not made aware of, and that's why the air looked that way. Because you've always got to watch the climate. Something crazy could be going on, as recent events have shown, right? Yes. And of course we have our group of individuals who are standing proud, and it's intriguing that they didn't have the state capitol built in the 1870s, but that's because they were busy building the temple, and that was the main focus. So it all makes sense. It's all separated. I really don't know what to tell you at this point when it comes to some of these state capitals, because of the fact that in some states you have accounts where you've got 5 or 6 buildings that are built on the exact same site. And what's interesting about the Utah State Capitol is this construction that seems to support its base. And that's a unique feature to it, supposedly. But then again, all the state capitals might have this feature because, well, oftentimes we just don't see the foundation or what's really under them. And of course, there's a whole element of the underground that we're going to be exploring in upcoming explorations where we consider the connectivity of these buildings. And we go on the inside and we see no less beauty here in the Utah State Capitol. And maybe, if we're going from the mainstream account, they should just consider themselves lucky that they didn't build their state capitol after 1940 because for some reason the aesthetic appeal seemed to decline a lot. We'll also have an upcoming exploration on that when we talk about the transition of Art Deco to brutalist architecture style. But no brutalism here. Beautiful dome, beautiful arcs, beautiful columns. Even this somewhat modest entryway, we see that there's a lot more inherent beauty in this than we would in a lot of other buildings, just with the columns themselves. And this might seem modest, but the reason I highlight this is because it shows you there does seem to be a little bit more of an aspect to some of these buildings that's dedicated to function. And yet the vast preponderance of them, especially on the interior, is dedicated to beauty, such as when you look up into the dome. Now, of course, you could say, well, they could do the paintings. There's all these beautiful paintings on the inside of these capitals. Yes, there is. And isn't it interesting how, with most of these paintings, it is very difficult to find things that tend to relate to what was actually going on at the time when these state capitals were constructed, or why it actually represents the American West. Because I always go back to our benchmark exploration in the state capital of Iowa, in Des Moines. And here you see the beautiful columns, the stairway. Look at the floor. Just a gorgeous, beautiful building. And yet you also see those pressed square patterns up in the arches. And yet that's something we've also seen in other buildings that were from a slightly later period. I guess all those master artisans that were just roaming the country in vast quantities in the late 19th, early 20th century were experts in doing such things. So you get that same feeling when you walk into the state capitol as you do in the other state capitals, and you can feel it with your intuition that there's something truly special and extraordinary about this building. Not even considering the columns and the handrails and the pillars that support the construction, but the stairway. You get the feeling that it's a grand entry, and just being in it gives you the impression of feeling enlightened. And here you see an individual looking up into the dome of the state capitol. And I suppose some of these paintings closer to the floor may seem like they involve the settlement of the West, although, interestingly enough, that terrain doesn't look like we'd expect the terrain around Salt Lake City to look like in current times. But, could be artistic license or whatever. And maybe a lot of those paintings were modified after the building was founded. And now we go to the Ogden High School, and this is a beauty from the 1930s. And it wouldn't be a full exploration unless we looked at a high school. And it wouldn't be a high school unless you had some aspect of what appears to be a castle, because in the early 20th century, your high school had to seem like it was a castle, or some other strange sort of building. Again, what's the point of the decoration on this building if this is indeed a high school? Ogden High School in the 1930s. And keep in mind, they said they completed this one in the mid-1930s during the Great Depression. So I guess the people of Utah were lucky in that they had jobs there. And once again, they were able to acquire all these materials and throw up this lavish building. Now, some other viewers have told me that in other cities they were messed up by the Great Depression, but it just seems to depend where you were. And they consider this Art Deco, even though this is mid-1930s. And look at the beauty of this auditorium. And remember, this is just a high school. And we saw some beautiful auditoriums in one of the high schools when we did the Detroit exploration. And we see that there's no issue out here in Utah. Now, what's going on in the 1930s? Well, we're told it's the Great Depression. We're told that people are suffering. People can't find jobs. Yet they were able to establish all this beauty and still adhere to the incredible aspects of the Art Deco style. Again, I believe this is a conflicting account, but a lot of people just accept what they're told. And you know what? That's your prerogative. If you want to believe whatever you're told, so be it. However, I'm not a person to just take what I'm told at face value because something doesn't seem to match with these accounts. And here we supposedly have an original construction photo or a layout photo of Ogden High School, yet there's something that seems strange about it. I guess it's nice that we can actually see clouds in the sky. That's a rarity. But why does this property just look like it's so open like this? And we'll be told, well, it's the classic construction photo. They had to have the means to get the blocks in there and build them. And yet it seems like it's always appeared that way from this aerial photo. So once again, who exactly knows what is going on with these buildings or what the true story is behind them? It always seems like when we look into the account a little bit more, we're posed with more questions and were posed with more conflicts in the mainstream account. I'm not even considering the previous civilization or anything like that. We go on to the Capitol Theater in Salt Lake City. This was constructed in 1913, a very auspicious or suspicious year in United States history, depending what your perception is. And I start with an interior photo because look at this beauty from 1913, supposedly. Unbelievable in terms of how it's laid out. And here's the front entrance. And on the outside, you still see a very decorative building. And I think of many of the opera houses and theaters that still endure to this day. And not just in the large cities like Salt Lake City, but even in the small towns, you'll still find opera houses, as though it was so important that they had entertainment. And we'll be told, well, it's because everything was spread out and, it was hard for people to get from point A to point B. Well, if it was hard to get from point A to point B, why was it easy to build these buildings? Why was it easier to build an opera house in your own town than it was to get in your horse and cart or your rudimentary automobile in the early 20th century and drive to a larger city? This reminds me of the one that we saw as we looked in earlier explorations because, again, you see the beauty in this entryway with the columns and the pillars and the arches. Once again, no detail spared. And this is just supposed to be a theater, and this is just supposed to be the entryway where people are milling about before they go in to actually watch the show. And yet I'm reminded of how much more gorgeous this is than many of our modern movie theaters or multiplexes. I mean, you can't wait to get out of the lobbyway. And I'll admit it's been a while since I've seen a movie because, frankly, there haven't been any movies since about a year or so that have compelled me to want to actually go. I think this would be enjoyable to see really any kind of show in, a live performance or what have you, just by the beauty of the interior of this auditorium or this theater in and of itself. 1913, and they were able to put that kind of detail and that kind of beauty within it. It's just something that we don't see anymore. And yes, I know we've been over the excuses many times, but again, what's really going on with these buildings? And why is Salt Lake City something that stands out so much? Because of the compressed timeline that we're given, because of the origin story of settlement, which is much more compressed than other cities. It's one thing to say that they were able to build the Iowa State Capitol in the 1870s because Iowa had at least been settled and it had adjacent states that were settled. But here in Salt Lake City, we're out in the middle of nowhere. And we're still relatively isolated even in the early 20th century. And yet they were able to achieve this. And to a lot of people, there's nothing to question about this because, they're told what they're told and that's that. And the Capitol Theater still stands today and it's still beautiful today, inside and outside, from 1913. 110 years old. And these are the kind of hallmark buildings that if you just accept aren't built anymore because of a lack of capability, then you'll pretty much accept whatever you're told. And we know there are a lot of people that like to accept what they're told. I understand. It's hard to ask questions. Now we go to the Salt Lake City County building. So the official account on this one is that it was built between 1891 and 1894. So we have something that sort of links the completion of the construction of the temple to the construction of the beautiful state capitol and some of the other edifices that we looked at in the early 20th century. 1891 to 1894, supposedly built by Freemasons, and who knows exactly on the veracity of that account. In any event, it is a very gorgeous building, and it reflects some of the other county buildings that we've seen in the other cities. So once again, we see conflicting architectural styles, but then we see the same architectural styles. Logistically, wouldn't it be difficult to be able to do all these conflicting architectural styles in these cities if we're to believe the mainstream account? No, just don't ask, just accept it. Once again, very beautiful building, and of course you'll get the usual explanation for why the stone looks aged, and I suppose the rustication account makes sense with buildings if you want to believe that, but why would you do it for a bridge? Well, in any event, here is another very convincing construction photo. Interesting kind of cranes. I was almost kind of hoping to see the hamster wheel cranes again make an appearance as we saw in that painted picture in the Tower of Babel. But, I guess we do actually see some people working along the ground, although exactly what are they doing? And that's a rarity in these photos. And here you see the scaling with the columns once again, and that's always one of the construction techniques and hallmarks that I'm impressed by, is how they could achieve scaling with the columns, building them small, building them large, and yet always using as weight bearing with these incredible structures. Just a municipal building, and yet once again looking at the interior, we see that there's more to be told within the interior. Very beautiful floor, large archways, and just a lot of interior space. Looks like you could probably get 10 to 15 people shoulder to shoulder walking through that large entryway. Well, you need to have a very large building, especially for a municipal building. You can't have people going around and asking questions or being stuffed up when they're looking for their government services. That's why we build the modern buildings that way, right? And once again, when you look on the inside, you see just some of the details that really don't make any sense. Why are you bothering putting squares or circles on the walls or the arches? Why are there unique patterns within the floor? Why do you bother with these kind of decorations on the exterior of the building? Is its function not government, or is its function supposed to be something else? Well, just don't ask and just accept what you're told. Because if you ask questions, you're just going to ask more questions. And then people don't like people who ask questions because you're just supposed to accept what you're told. Again, another beautiful building. And I'm reminded probably of St. Louis a little bit and the City Hall in Milwaukee quite a bit as well. Again, you see some of the faces and some of the symbols that go around in these arched stone patterns that are constructed. And there's that beehive again. Now, if there was a previous civilization, could there have been different elements of it or different aspects of it? Absolutely. Some people want to dismiss that theory and maybe go with an alternative reality theory. I can consider both because right now I'm seeing evidence for both. And I think Salt Lake City is a prime example of different theories could apply. But what I can say is that if you just go off the mainstream account, you just dismiss everything as, well, it had to be true. It's the mainstream account. You're really sweeping a lot of things under the rug, and you're really accepting a lot of things that don't make sense. And perhaps that's more comfortable for you. And like I said, I understand. It's very disturbing to consider the fact that things aren't what we're told. It's very disturbing to consider the fact that our reality might not be what we think it is. Yet looking on the exterior of this building, little gargoyle figure there, very interesting, and yet you see some of the beautiful decorative detail in these columns. Now, granted, it looks like they're constructed modularly or in pieces, but, that it's not a carved gargoyle. It's obviously some sort of construction kit. And finally, we go to the Saltair Palace, a beautiful resort that supposedly dates from the 1890s and has quite a history to it. The Saltair Palace, right off of Salt Lake itself, just west of Salt Lake City. And there's been a lot of gorgeous pictures of this incredible palace. And there's many different variations of it. We see something that's very beautiful and doesn't really, once again, make a lot of sense for what's just supposed to be a resort in the 1890s west of Salt Lake City. And this is something else where I don't think there's an easy or simple explanation because we see pictures that show the glory and the detail of this building. And of course, you can always come up with the explanation, well, it was just made of temporary construction, it was stucco, it was balsa wood basically that just somehow happened to stand up to the mighty winds and the other elements of nature. Or once again, maybe, nature was a lot more simple. The weather was always 50 to 70 degrees and there were no winds, and that's why the skies always look very vanilla and have no detail to them. Although I think we can see clouds in this photo, so I'll give a little credit where credit's due there. There's a lot of people milling about. It looks like it's a grand old time. Look at the detail, though, in the construction of this building. Again, you see the archway, and it looks like there's stones. Now, this building's long gone. You'll never guess how it disappeared. But I don't know if that's actually masonry work or if that really is some sort of facade. I don't know, and I'm going to admit that. Still, regardless of whether it was a temporary structure or a permanent structure, it did supposedly stand for many decades. We just don't know what the actual construction of it was, because unlike the other buildings we looked at, this building is not standing today. Yet there's something about it that invokes beauty in the imagination. And look at the coloring and the detail in this, and of course the large stairways, and we have a roller coaster. And I do have a video coming up that's going to posit some theories about what the other functions of roller coasters could have been, because you see that in Coney Island as well. Just a beautiful palace. And a beautiful resort that's really, at the time, just out in the middle of nowhere. Because remember, 1890s, how populated was Salt Lake City? So we can look at the official population records, but how in the heck can you accept the fact that there was only just a couple hundred settlers who built all this in just a few short decades? I mean, maybe you want to accept that, and that's fine. But you see what this was, just an incredible, beautiful resort. And is it the remnant of something? Is it something from an alternative existence? Is it both? Yes, and here I think they called this the Hippodrome, and just gorgeous and beautiful and just out in the middle of nowhere in the 1890s, early 20th century. You could see, though, why this would be a real draw. And personally, I think this is something that's superior to current Disney World or Disneyland. Just my opinion, but I'm just talking about the architectural beauty of this building. And of course, there's a lot of specials you can find on the rise and fall of the Great Saltair. Lost Lakefront Resort. And why was it lost? Well, we'll get to it in a second. But you have some other photos where you just see how incredibly beautiful this building was. And what was its original function is something that I wonder. Could this have been some sort of power plant? Could this have been something with processing the high salt content in the water? Could it have some other function? We're not really sure. Yet, why would you go to this length of effort to build something like this if it was intended to be a resort, regardless of whether the construction materials were temporary or permanent? Again, it's as though nobody had anything better to do. They didn't have to worry about survival. And this wonderful edifice was destroyed by a fire in the 1970s. And who knows on the veracity of that account, because we're always told how fires managed to destroy large masonry capitol buildings in other states, and multiple large masonry capitol buildings in other states. And here's the beauty that you'll find there today. Yes, this is definitely something that looks like temporary construction. Well, I hope you appreciated this exploration of Salt Lake City. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and thank you for joining me.